Excited to have our guest today. This is a little different in several ways. We're doing it off-site for us, on-site for the guest, but if you saw the site, you would understand why we're thrilled to be on-site. It's also different because even though most folks expect us to talk about health and wellness, and we've had doctors, esteemed fitness gurus, I think a part of wellness and health that is almost always overlooked but critical is your environment, kind of the vibe, and whether it's architecture, space, the interplay between indoors and outdoors. And if you get a shot of this, you can kind of, while I'm saying the words, you can see this is pretty magical. I've only been here for a few minutes, just sat down, and I already feel kind of moved. And so today we're very fortunate to have one of the co-founders and the CEO of Grace Farms, which many of you probably heard of, some of you haven't. It's not far from our home base in the tri-state. It's here in Connecticut. It's stunning is an understatement. And I want to kind of give the mic to Adam. We like to start with kind of the origin story. One thing I've learned talking to a lot of people who've done a lot of cool things is, the folks who are doing something that's special usually end up there because their journey was special. It's very rare in my experience when I talk to folks like you that it was, hey, this is what I wanted to do when I was 6 years old. I think a lot of people are like, well, you must have wanted to do this all your life. I find that the folks that are doing something unique got there in a unique way. So would love to start with just hearing your background and your journey.
Yeah. Well, to start, I'll first clarify, I'm co-founder and CEO of Grace Farms Tea and Coffee, which is the nonprofit-owned public benefit subsidiary of Grace Farms Foundation. And the way that really the nucleus of everything with Grace Farms began with a vision to create more grace and peace in the world. Some very committed, aspirational, visionary people who were able to see a piece of land that's this beautiful 80-acre property here in New Canaan, Connecticut, and were able to turn it into this incredible cultural and humanitarian center called Grace Farms, which is free and open to the public 6 days a week. And we opened in 2015. I personally joined Grace Farms about 6 months before we opened to the public, as we were finishing construction. And I joined, I actually started as a volunteer, to your point, right? How you get involved in something isn't always a naturally straight course. So prior to Grace Farms, after I finished school, I traveled the world for a while. I worked for a safari company in Kenya. I worked for an orphanage in other parts of East Africa. And then ultimately, I ended up in ski resorts out in Lake Tahoe, California. I was the food and beverage director for the two largest ski resorts out there. Met my wife in San Francisco. And as it turns out, she was from Connecticut. And we had the opportunity to come back and get involved in Grace Farms prior to its opening as construction was starting to finish up, and really start to think about how we could create a place, not just an incredible architecture and design, which was ultimately the portrait that had been created, right, for people to be able to interact with, but that is just a building. What makes a place is the people and the message and the work behind it. So we've been able to get involved with Grace Farms as it was opening, and we've been involved now for the last 10 years. I started as the Director of Operations and Sustainability after volunteering and realizing this is just such an incredible place and opportunity to be involved with. So I had ultimately just an incredible experience seeing how people could interact with architecture, nature, art, be inspired by a space, and realizing how a space can change the way people look at the world and how they leave, right? In many ways, our tea expert and educator, Frank, he says, we're not worried about who comes, we're worried about how everyone leaves. So that's a bit of the backstory on how I got involved with Grace Farms and just a small sliver of what Grace Farms is.
Okay, that's useful. That is a unique background,
Yeah.
unique journey. So my guess was right. When you talk about how a space can kind of transform how someone leaves and even something as audacious as their perspective on the world, I understand that as, and I'll speak for you here, as a high-level mission of Grace Farms, but I also know you guys have, more poignant mission. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So Grace Farms Foundation, which is a private operating foundation, owns and operates Grace Farms and really is focused on creating more grace and peace in the world, which is the bigger vision, right? Now, how do we make that happen? To begin with, on the cultural side of this space, we host a wide variety of public programming, ranging from, we've hosted the London Philharmonic Orchestra, we've hosted Nobel laureates, senators, very high-profile speakers and artists. But at the same time, too, yesterday we had a kids' art studio, and the day before that was Bunny Book Group for 2-year-olds, right? So, creating a space that is safe, welcoming, and inspiring is one of the ways that we create a place for the local and global community to come together, to experience nature, encounter the arts, foster community, and ultimately that leads to the humanitarian work of Grace Farms Foundation, which is pursuing justice. So Grace Farms, as you can tell, is this really significant, incredible architectural space, which was designed by Tokyo-based architecture firm Sana. And we really think about our humanitarian work sitting at the intersection of architecture and justice. And our founder and visionary, Sharon Prince, she defined from the very beginning that our stake in the ground, the most meaningful humanitarian work we can do is to end forced and child labor. She'd seen this in her travels, and it wasn't until here at Grace Farms this realization that forced and child labor not only exists in the food industry, right? The fair trade and ethical and sustainable supply chain movement actually began with coffee in the 1980s with the fair trade movement in Mexico. And then we are certainly have become aware of fast fashion, sweatshops, Rana Plaza being a significant disaster that made a lot of awareness around the working conditions for those that make our clothing. And Sharon realized that there is this third denominator that we all share, which is shelter. It's the built environment, right? It's our homes, it's our hospitals, it's our cultural centers, it's our schools, it's everything that we've created as humans, the built environment. So for us to be able to define our work sitting at this intersection of architecture and justice has ultimately created this movement, which is called Design for Freedom, which is a movement to disrupt and ultimately end forced and child labor in the building materials supply chain. We work with the largest architecture firms, construction firms, engineering firms, suppliers to begin by raising awareness that, yes, there is forced and child labor in the building materials supply chain, right? So we're talking about like the wood, concrete, glass, all of these materials that are surrounding us right now. And then how do we provide the tools to avoid materials that are at risk of having forced labor in them? Because once there's forced labor in your building material and you build it, that ultimately that modern slavery is embedded in your building forever. You're not going to remove that, and you aren't sure, so you would rather just go in without any doubt. Sharon describes it in a really great way that what is the true cost to, whether it's to buy a shirt or to build a building, what is the true cost of that? And we've been accepting the slavery discount for far too long. So, so that's a summary of the humanitarian work that occurs here at Grace Farms, which is just such an incredible movement to get to be part of. And I have the honor of getting to support that in a really unique and delicious way.
That's cool. That's great. There's a lot of organizations with a lot of missions. That's not one I've come across.
Yeah.
I think probably because it's a bit occult. It doesn't stare at you in the face. There's a lot of worthy missions like solving homelessness and poverty that you can see every day. And I think that probably is why, it's a bit of a challenge. And before we leave that, I'm a pediatrician, so
Yeah.
child theme hits home. But before we leave that, I think it's really beautiful and interesting to hear what you guys are trying to do at your level. And a practical question, if someone's listening or watching, how can I, Joe Smith, living wherever, when I go to the store, kind of like I pick organic foods or
Yeah.
farm to table, what's a practical day-to-day way to make sure I'm not kind of inadvertently investing into child labor?
Yeah, such a great question. And we wrestled with this ourselves. There's certainly the idea of conscious consumerism, and there's a growing number of people who want to support that. In fact, right, the gross sales of products, that percentage continues to grow with those that have sustainable or ethical attributes to them. So we know this is not just a fad, this is a trend, certainly as younger generations want to make a difference, because they're going to be left with the bill that the generations before us have been writing through their consumption habits. And I'll use that as a segue into what we're enjoying drinking right here. And I'll explain how tea and coffee has become a major part of how the experience here at Grace Farms, but also beyond. So as I was explaining that Grace Farms is a cultural and humanitarian center, and I just explained a lot of really in-depth work that happens here, the programming here. And so when you have something that's this new, right, of a concept, how do you even begin to welcome people so that they're not overwhelmed or confused? And Frank, our director of hospitality and tea expert, he had a previous career in the tea business and is truly a tea master. And he recognized that tea could be this medium, this communication tool, a way to welcome people, so that really our reputation was one of hospitality, and tea is the second most consumed beverage in the world after water. 6 billion cups are enjoyed every single day. It's a global sign of generosity and hospitality, so why not lead with that? Coffee is obviously a big part of American society, so how could we have coffee also be a big part of the experience here? So for those that have been here on site and had tea with Frank, they've seen that. If you've ever been to our Commons, which is our cafe a little bit further down the building here, you've seen really beautiful coffee and tried the coffee, and you're like, wow, this is different. So that being a big part of the experience here on site, and I was, as mentioned, the Director of Operations and Sustainability, and I was getting my MBA at New York University, NYU, and was focused on social entrepreneurship and impact, and basically wrote my senior thesis, if you will, on this recent change in the IRS code, something called the Philanthropic Enterprise Act, which happened in 2019 and says that private foundations, like Grace Farms Foundation, are allowed to own 100% of for-profit companies. Prior to that, it was not allowed. And it opened up the door to this new type of business model that is truly philanthropic in its nature, in that there's no confusion about where the profits are going to, because it requires 100% of the profits are owned by this nonprofit. So as I was reading this, I said, well, this could have a really big impact on what I believe the whole capitalist system, that if a company that is nonprofit owned and giving back 100% of its profits has a competitive advantage to the other, competitors in the market by being able to communicate to these conscious consumers, like, with every single dollar you spend, you're investing in making a difference. So as I was studying this, what happens in 2020? The pandemic. Grace Farms has to close, so we're no longer open to the public, and ultimately proposed to the board of Grace Farms Foundation, what if we were to create a nonprofit-owned company, a tea and coffee company, with 3 distinct goals. The first is to invite everyone to experience Grace Farms through our signature coffees and teas. The second is to educate and demonstrate on ethical and sustainable supply chains, right? So directly connecting back to our humanitarian work, right? We're not just, making widgets to sell them to give back the money. No, we're actually going into a supply chain that's at risk of having forced labor in it in the tea and coffee industry. And how do we do that, right? We're the first and only US-based tea company to partner with Fair Trade International, which is the original and gold standard of fair trade certifications. The second is we source our coffees exclusively from women-led co-ops in Ethiopia, Colombia, and Indonesia. Why does that matter? Well, personally, I think that coffee tastes better because it's been cultivated with more care, but also women invest 3 times more back into their communities than men. These are sourced from smallholder farms, not big plantations that have migrant workforces coming through harvest season, right? We're directly impacting that female farmer who is being able to take that money, put it into her pocket, and reinvest it into her children or her grandchildren's education, whatever it might be. And then the third reason why we started this company is to give back 100% of the profits to support Design for Freedom, the movement to ending forced and child labor that I was just describing. So it has this really incredible, these layers, right? It's not just, and which can sometimes be really challenging for a brand. You go to marketing 101 and they're like, what does your brand stand for? Can you give me one word? And it's like, with this, I can't. But I'm willing to bet that, right, the customer who's going to resonate with this wants to peel back the onion a couple times. And they want to hear about, right, that the packaging is compostable. They want to hear about the importance of organic ingredients and not only how it's better for you, the consumer, but also better for farmers and our planet long term, right? So this is the approach that we're taking. We're playing a long game here, and it's paying off, and in multiple different ways, which is, to your point, when you think about, you mentioned earlier, what is your dream like to, and this is my dream, but I never thought it was going to look like this. So it's really incredible to get to share it with people.
Yeah, that's a pretty amazing narrative you just painted, and I have a lot of it kind of triggered a bunch of thoughts. First of all, you should know, Adam. So in our organization, Baker Health, it's a holistic take on primary care. There's more to it, but for the purpose of this conversation, that suffices. So even when you come to one of the locations, it's like your doctor's office. You go down the hall to see the doctor, and here there's a yoga studio or whatever, vitamin infusions. We have meditation classes in the offices. Next Sunday, I'm going to be involved with our director of wellness, Sharon, who's actually been out here in an anxiety session for some of our members. But
nice.
we try to have very organic, natural, kind of whole food type snacks. Mm-hmm. And we've had it for 3.5 years. And the kids come in, they love snacks, but they love any snack. Yeah. And then when we started using your tea, which I think we started using your products maybe 3-4 months ago. I kid you not, if you go to any of our team members, all of a sudden, I just got a bunch of texts from Sarah, from Mo, from all our team leads. They're like, Z, I was doing a vitamin infusion downstairs, and Mrs. Whatever was like, where'd you get that tea? And what you said about it, kind of, it being delicious and so on. And then it actually leads to them asking questions that now I can give the answers to my team. And so it's interesting. You wouldn't think, or I wouldn't think that, a space or a beverage can be the aperture for this like whole world of like kind of convoluted, some unfortunate disparities that can then kind of raise awareness and inspire action, right? But listening to kind of you go from the root cause of your mission and walking me through it is fascinating and inspiring. And now I'm seeing it, the people start to ask about the tea, and you could end the conversation with how they can make the world a better place. So it's really beautiful to listen to. I wanna kind of pick up one other thing you said. Yeah. So you were at Stern getting your MBA, and one thing in my world as a physician, there's an overlap here. We try to help people. What you're doing is to help people. That's what gets you out of bed, right? And that's what gets us out of bed. In our world, healthcare has become kind of anything but. It's not very healthy and it's not very caring. And physicians generally are, in the middle of it. And now a big reason there's so much of a mess in healthcare is not that there's a shortage of financing or support, right? We spend on healthcare more than we do on anything else. It's almost $4 trillion a year. It's that there's misaligned incentives, and unfortunately, and I used to work in corporate healthcare and so on, what you come to find out is the people who understand the financing the most and end up controlling the decisions. Right. It's not what people think from the outside, which is, well, the doctor, right? The doctor controls it, right? No. The doctor's now shifted and is kind of a pawn. And so one thing I try to do is I try to educate doctors or tell them to get educated on kind of the financial mechanisms, not for their own gain. Doctors make a good living. That's not why. We do fine. It's more so that they can, unfortunately, now to have the impact you want on people's lives, you have to be aware of the financial stream. One small example, if I write you a prescription, it's out of network, it's deductible, but something like a third of the time you get a prescription as an American, you don't even fill it because of a financial consideration. Of course, they don't teach us that in medical school, right? All we know is the mechanism of action. Well, it turns out us not knowing the financial kind of halo on medicine or surgery will have a bigger impact on our patients' decision-making, compliance, or clinical outcomes than anything else. And so there's this whole mess. At the center of it is financial incentives or disincentives. There's a lot of talk about that now with the new administration. Like, whatever your political views are, at least it's bubbling to the surface, right? And so when I was listening to you, you hear about, somebody, as special as you doing something as special as you're doing, and it's interesting that kind of the light kind of went off when you're studying business and you saw this kind of opportunity. Can you talk about kind of from your perspective where, the fact that you structured it as a non-for-profit and so on, how has that served you? And for folks that are kind of inspired to do good in the world, where some fundamental business understanding can be a difference maker?
Yeah, wow. Great connection, great question. I think that setting up a nonprofit-owned business is going to, I recognize that's going to be incredibly rare. And for 99.9% of businesses, it won't work in that way. However, if somebody is able to fund a venture with the intention of giving the profits back, and yeah, I have a paycheck, right? It's not like I am doing this volunteering to do it, right? This is my livelihood. But with the intention that the long-term benefit, right, the value created of the equity of that company is going to have a much greater impact by reinvesting into charitable causes, right? That can act as a dividend back to a nonprofit organization, which is ultimately is dependent on donation. So can we flip that around where you have a very entrepreneurial approach to the philanthropic world, right? In many ways, you're talking about like, yeah, we do need to flip healthcare on its head. And we're kind of looking at is, can we flip philanthropy on its head by encouraging other foundations to take a more entrepreneurial approach? It's not a handout, right? It's participation. So, call it philanthropic capitalism, if you will. The consumer is participating in micro philanthropy. We're not waiting for, we're not dependent on Bill Gates to write the next big check to solving the world's problems. And he's acknowledged he cannot continue to carry all the weight. It requires everyone to be part of it. So can there be leadership from those that are able to create a nonprofit-owned business like this one? Or, I'll also give a shout out to like Newman's Own, which is another nonprofit-owned business that gives back all the money to supporting children, to your point. And so that, I really do believe that we're in a point in time where we cannot rely on government to serve the needs of all the people. Inherently, the majority of people participating in the for-profit, right, capitalist system adhere by Milton Friedman's laws that your sole responsibility is to serve the shareholder. It has nothing to do with stakeholder capitalism and the externalities and impact that your business has on the rest of the world. That is that is an archaic and dangerous approach and is not sustainable long term, which we've learned, right? And so just like healthcare is intended to sustain people, it's intended to give them longevity, right? And we cannot deny that that our economy and our civilization is dependent and is built around capitalism and competition, and that is good. But can that be redirected in those companies that are giving that back be honored and recognized for doing that? And it's difficult. I'll tell you what, no for-profit coffee or tea company wants to share their profit share with the nonprofit-owned company, right? They'll say, oh, that's great, but as soon as you start taking space on the shelf in Whole Foods, you're now a competitor with me, and I will do whatever I can to try to stop you. And it's really interesting. I was talking with my wife about this, as we're now making these really exciting jumps, there are, what I will call these negative forces that are trying to hold us back. But I actually look at that as a sign that we're on the precipice of doing something truly extraordinary. That our next chapter is unfolding. These next levels are happening. And so I would say that to anyone who wants to consider, dedicating their life to a philanthropic or a business combined with philanthropic approach, that just know, first, the competition is very real, and everyone will, say you're doing a great job, but everyone wants to get their cut of money along the way. Nobody's going to give you a discount. So that's a challenge. Second thing is, just like every business, you got to get the product and the marketing right, and then you can get lucky. I will say that luck and hard work seem to be correlated, but once you have a customer base who know that the quality of the product, the way it makes them feel, the way it tastes, and then that you layer that in with all this extra purpose, that is going to create loyalty, knowing that you're part of something greater. And in fact, our tagline is share in something greater for that reason.
That's fascinating, because you now have to, in this world, kind of, half of your being is like the philanthropic, what am I doing this for? And it's obviously a very positive output. But in order to be successful at the level you want, you're kind of having to be like dog eat dogs competitive with other tea or coffee companies. Now your mission is a little bit different, as you said. They're looking at a stock price potentially. You're looking at, hey, I can help this many more people if we are able to move this many units. And I think that's a fascinating dichotomy, right? Because and it takes, I think, somebody with the ability to kind of carry multiple thoughts at once in their head, so to speak. And as you were saying that, I think it's really fascinating, right? I think most people that I know, most people out there, they're one or the other, right? I have family and friends that are extremely kind of personally mission, humanistic in their drive, right? They devote themselves to going to parts of the world. I have several friends and family, parts of the world that need help, and they bring their education and their expertise and their resources to help those people. And then I have friends in finance. I have friends that live not far from here in Connecticut and Westchester that work at a bank, and they're really good at that. But that crossover, sometimes people, you'll hear about it, but it's few and far in between, and it's rarely, even when you do hear about it, as deeply rooted as you kind of elucidated. So much like the space is unique and the grounds are breathtaking, I think so is when you peel the onion and you look a layer deeper at kind of what's going on underneath this beautiful space is just as intricate and just as, frankly, complicated architecture, right, in the mission itself. And it's fascinating to learn about. And you're right, it's not something that could ever come across in a soundbite, right? And it's almost like you're taking wellness. What we're doing is taking wellness outside of the doctor's exam room and saying, well, you only see me as your primary care doctor once every 365 days for 0.001% of your, so, well, you could do yoga classes twice a week, you could do meditation, we have virtual stuff. So now we're kind of more of a part of your life. Yeah. And you guys are doing the same. Even kind of consumer choices can be considered a form of wellness, right? In the way you're kind of painting the picture. And as I'm sitting, it's wash over me and I'm learning a lot. One question kind of along the theme of, really redefining wellness, which as I'm talking to you, I feel like is happening. You have, as you mentioned, you've had illustrious people come speak here. You've had good, cool collaborations. I know there was one with Lululemon. We were involved with it. So there's a lot of cool stuff. Can you talk specifically, and I know there's a lot of art and culture, and that's fascinating, but just because of my background and kind of what folks tune in for, some of the highlights you've seen where you've done something creative with wellness, whether it's partnerships or symposiums, that folks who are interested in that can learn from?
Yeah, wow, that's a good question. I would say back to the connecting the humanitarian work with the way that people leave and how they feel inspired. The number of times we get emails and letters all the time. Somehow people send them to even my house, right? Like, I don't know how they've even found my address, but they're like, Adam, I was at Grace Farms and you gave us a tour and served tea to us. We met Frank and, I didn't tell you at the time, but my mother just passed away. And that was the exact moment that I needed to make myself feel better. Or we've been at shows and you just have this connection with somebody and you end up giving them a tea and you're like, look, like, I think you just be well from this. And then next thing you know, they open up about like what's happening in their life and they're so appreciative. So this idea of, in my opinion, it comes back to our name, this idea of grace, right? To define it in its simplest terms is unmerited favor. But that is what's, saves all of us, is when we're down in the dumps and having a tough time, it's that doctor who says, there's something more going on here, like, please tell me how else I can help. It's not going to be another prescription that's going to help them. It's a conversation. It's putting them on another path, helping them recognize that humanity is necessary for every single person to experience. And when that humanity is stripped from us, whether that's the beauty of art or the concept of togetherness or this idea of just generosity, that is a power to uplift people that no medicine could ever provide. Now, and so I know this sounds crazy, but in 10 years, I've seen like pretty close to miracles happening here. Like, there's just, call it serendipity, whatever you want. There's just something that surrounds this place. Call it karma, I don't care. But when there's this much good intention going into the world, you receive those things back. And that's not to say, as I said earlier, that there's going to be negative forces that are going to try to stop it. But in the end, good will win, and people recognize that, and that's what makes people feel really, really good. And yeah, of course, you do need to take some of that ownership on yourself, right? Are you going to commit to, I don't know, buying another pack of Oreos or buying something that's going to make you really feel good? Are you going to commit to doing yoga twice a week or sitting and binge watching Netflix? Like, yes, you do have to take some responsibility for that. You have to take responsibility for that. But to get that inspiration, this is a place to get that and to just experience grace and peace.
That's great. Tell me, before, I want to be respectful of your time. You've been kind enough to share your story and a lot of time. What's next for Grace Farms? Everything, meaning, kind of the holding non-for-profit, the tea, the coffee. You kind of alluded to kind of the forward progress of the product. Just be curious, because it seems like everything you guys are doing is very tedious. It's done with a lot of care. Back to the, business, non-business dichotomy. It's not like there's a business opportunity, let's do it. It's kind of, there's a way to further our mission. It seems like when you guys do something, just by looking around, listening to you and tasting the tea, you do it at the highest and most kind of caring level. It seems to me that comes from the inspiration that the mission brings to you, right? Since if your mission is try to make a buck, right? If you're a coffee or a tea company or whatever, a hall that rents space, well, there's somebody who's willing to pay you. That's all the work you need to know, right? I'm just willing to do it. When a mission is as kind of, careful as the one you guys try to serve, it's showing. And so I'm curious, I'm sure you don't have like a quarterly plan necessarily the way most people do, but I'm sure you do have some kind of trajectory, like you're picking up momentum. I can feel it, right? What's next? And I ask it more half out of curiosity and half so folks listening can see what they can do to kind of further and accelerate the cause.
Yeah, great question. Well, so we have 6 values here at Grace Farms. It's grace, peace, excellence, which goes back to the thoughtfulness and care that we put into everything. Openness, right? The sense of transparency, direct dialogue. We're not trying to hide anything. Meaning, so just what you said, right? And then the last one is new outcomes. So hopefully, you've seen these values play out in this conversation. And then this idea of the new outcomes. So we don't know what the future will hold, but to that point where I see amazing things constantly happening, because we're a place that brings people together and encourages collaboration. And, we work with large government organizations like the State Department and the overseas building offices to build our embassies without, forced labor in the building material supply chain. But we also work with the local domestic violence center here in Fairfield County. So like when you're starting to collaborate with that many individuals and you're encouraging people to bring their wherewithal, next thing you know, like people, these, again, unexpected outcomes start happening. So ending forced and child labor. Slavery has been part of humanity since the beginning of time. And in fact, there's more people caught in modern slavery today. It's about 28 million people, is more than any time in our history. So our life work here is going to surpass my life, but it's a worthwhile endeavor. So what does the future look like for us? It is ultimately, right, when all the large businesses and the governments are aligned that we are no longer going to accept forced labor in our food, clothing, shelter, and we build policy around that and it's implemented. So that's where we're going to continue to work. On the tea and coffee side of things, what's been the most exciting is a corporate partnership food service program that we launched. Right, the individual canisters are fantastic. Like I said, we love selling them at Whole Foods, but partners like Baker Health that are values aligned and want to be able to take care of their clients, their employees, their their stakeholders, whoever they may be, with a very visible and highly organic, not only literally organic, but like it's a natural thing to when you go up and somebody offers you a cup of coffee or tea when you're coming in, and you're like, wow, Grace Farms, I think I've heard of that. And then you're like, this tea's delicious, tell me more. And it starts a conversation, right? Our teas are, for example, at the World Economic Forum, and we've heard from them that Grace Farms became the icebreaker between, right, a diplomat and somebody who is, high up in a government, and it was like, oh, I've heard of Grace Farms, like, and oh, tell me what Grace Farms is, and that was like, these unexpected outcomes. So, but we've got some very, very exciting large corporate partnerships that we've launched this year, more happening in the future, and yeah, in the next near future, the very foreseeable future, Grace Farms is going to start becoming a very familiar name to people, and we'll be seeing it a lot more.